Welcome everyone to Contractors Beware False Claims Act Exemptions, DoD AI Hustle, Budgeting, and a Big Beautiful Bill. I'm PCI's John Plinky, joined today by our expert instructors Nicole Latala and Bill Walter. Before we get started, I have only a few short housekeeping announcements today. Because of this short session, you cannot get CPE or CLP credit for this program, but you can get a certificate of completion. It will be emailed to you 24 hours after the program. So tomorrow around 2, you'll get an email with a certificate linked in it. In addition to that, during the program today, we invite your questions. Please put your questions in the chat. Bill and Nicole will do their best to address your questions. Thank you all for joining us today. Take it away, guys.
All right. Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Today, we're going to be talking about a few updates since our last show, which I think was about 4 weeks ago. A lot of changes, but not a significant number of increased executive orders. But now we're kind of seeing the trudge of how these things are actually being implemented and how things are going. So today we're going to start off by talking about the status of the FAR overhaul, the Federal Acquisition Regulation 2.0, as some people have been calling it. We'll talk a little bit about a big, beautiful bill. And it's not just me being a big, beautiful bill, but it's a big, beautiful bill with Congress that's going to solve all the problems of the world. And Nicole will talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the budget. And then we're going to close off today's session with things to watch. So we've got a smattering of things that we can put in there. So let's start off by talking about the FAR overhaul update. This is under the executive order that's titled Restoring Common Sense to Federal Procurement. And as a part of this, the president tasked the Office of Federal Procurement Policy and the FAR Council to take that 2,000 plus page federal acquisition regulation here and make it more manageable, make it more statutory, make it so that it is easier for people to use so that they can contract with the federal government. And they tagged a new acronym for us called the RFO, which stands for the Revolutionary FAR Overhaul. There's a website that's on if you just Google RFO overhaul, it's going to pop right up. You'll be able to go in to see what the government's been doing. The Office of Procurement Policy and the FAR Council is the group that's doing it. But the goal behind all of this is to streamline the FAR, get acquisitions done faster. Some acquisitions these days can take 2-3 years before they get awarded. That's a lot of time and a lot of expense of government resources and contractor resources that are just additional cost. And if you have to wait 2 to 3 years to get something, it's okay. Is it what I'm going to need? Is it going to be the best technology? Whatever. So the concept here is to really speed this up. They wanted to return the FAR to its statutory roots, make sure that any rewrites are in plain language, and remove any of the rules that are non-statutory. What they're going to do when they take all that language out of the FAR, some of that was instructions for the contracting officer, because the FAR is the contracting officer's contracting guidebook. They're going to be putting some additional buying guides. And 4 weeks ago, we weren't sure exactly what those were going to look like or how that was going to work. Oops, I was looking at the first question, but we'll get to that here in just a minute, Michelle. So I'm thinking, can people see the slides, John? Because I still see the poll on my screen.
Yeah, okay. I don't see it.
There we are. I got it. Or Bill got it.
Okay, because mine shows sharing is paused.
There we go.
Okay. I see it now. Okay, so.
I thought it was just me, Bill, so I'm glad it wasn't just me.
Okay. Well, I'm not afraid to raise my hand and say, hey, I see an issue here. Oh, and thank you, Tina. Tina couldn't see them either. But anyhow, with this executive order, immediately we saw a bunch of things pop out. There were allegations, the rumors of a 100-page FAR and all sorts of things like that. Well, now a lot of that has settled down, and we're actually seeing on the acquisition.gov website, there is a listing of all of the FAR sites. And in that listing, it identifies that they've already taken action on some of these elements of the FAR. So the first one that came out was in May 2nd, so a little over a month ago, and that reviewed FAR Part 1, and it basically established the mission first goal of the FAR, trying to pull it back to putting a lot of control into the contracting officer's lap again, where it always has been. But to really say, look, these tools are designed to get the tools, the equipment, the services that the federal employee needs to get their job done. So it really took portions of the FAR out that were just words that were thrown in, and they said these aren't required by statute. And if you go to that acquisition.gov website, you can actually see the old FAR Part 1. You can see a summary as to what was changed. You can see a line out where they say, we took out these sections of this particular FAR section. And then you can see goals, etc. And it's actually a training web page for government employees where they can log into it. And when they go through each session, each FAR update, it will give them ideas as to what has changed. So FAR Part 1 came out, and when I read it, I didn't really see much of a change from the actual intent of the FAR, but I did see a lot of removal of verbiage that was in there to really focus and hone it down. This was even more prevalent in FAR Part 34, which is Major Systems Acquisition, where it got rid of a bunch of the mother may I's and the other elements, and it reduced it down to two sections. One is Earned Value Management Systems, and the other is Industrial Resources Essential to National Defense. So for major programs, those are the only two pieces that are left. And one of the nice things about it was the previous clauses were pretty broad, and this one were pretty tight with what you needed to have for an approved system, et cetera. And this revised FAR clause that came with this update to FAR Part 34, it gives a lot more control to the contracting officer to work with companies to get these tools in place. So my first read of the first couple of sections that came out were pretty positive. A couple of weeks later, on May 22nd, they issued a new FAR Part 10, which is market research. And what it did was it retained three key elements. It retained the preference for commercial products and services. So if you have a prime contract and you have subcontractors, if a contracting officer is going out for bid, the preference for buying commercial goods and services is still the preference. So they retain that. They retain the planning and solicitation requirements. So the contracting officer still has to follow guidelines for planning a solicitation and issuing a solicitation and getting the advertising and everything in place. And it also kept let's have communication between government and industry. Let's have those industry days. Let's have those things where we can identify what our needs are, and we can take information from the commercial marketplace to see what sorts of tools and resources they may have available that are coming in. A big part of FAR Part 10 that it looked like about half the people on the call were from the government, half the people were from industry. So the government employees are going to be able to have access to several new tools for market research that industry will not have access to. And I've had a lot of calls about this because I saw a webinar that was put on a couple of weeks ago where the GSA and the Office of Federal Procurement Policy identified their update to market research. So they've taken a whole host of information that they have on contracting, and that's now available to contracting officers. So they can look up prices of contracts, detailed prices of contracts, all sorts of other information about pricing and market research type tools that they can use to try to leverage more contracts through FAR Part 12 utilizing market research. And if you are familiar with FAR Part 12 and FAR Part 15, they identified that the government, when they go out to determine that a price is fair and reasonable, they're supposed to look in their own boxes first. They're supposed to look inside their own channels and talk to government employees. And what happens is if I'm in a small group within the Navy, I'm going to know the small group of people that I have in the Navy, and I may reach over the cubicle to talk to them to see if they've ever purchased this product or service before. Well, with these new tools that are coming out, and I'm sure it's going to be rough for the first couple of years with these tools because any new tool is going to be tough. But what is happening is now a contracting officer can reach beyond the walls of their own office to see what other people are buying, what types of services, what types of products. So this procurement co-pilot that the government is coming out with looks to be a very interesting and very powerful tool, and it's coming out in concert with the FAR Part 10 update. So you can tell they've been looking at this for a while to try to get this out. Okay, and since we only have a half hour today, I did want to hit a couple of other items here. June 12th, last week, they did issue another update to FAR Part 18, which is emergency acquisitions. FAR Part 39, which is the acquisition of information and communication technology, as well as FAR Part 43, which is contract modifications. I will tell you that not a lot has changed in FAR Part 43. The contracting officer has a lot of leeway with how they price changes to the contract, and none of that has been stripped away. So as we take a look at this, we have 51 parts of the FAR. I'm not going to include forms, and I'm not going to include clauses because each one of these comes out with their own clauses. So FAR 52, 201, 234, 210, 218, 239, and 243 have come out with updates to clauses. Now, one of the elements of this that does come out is as the contracting officer looks at this new FAR and they say, hey, wait a minute here, this is a little bit different than what I have in my FAR that's online and what I learned at DAU or FAI, wherever it is. And so the guidance that's coming out for the contracting officer also provides for the use of deviations. And if there's something in here that comes out that can help you speed it up, you can use it directly. If you need to put a deviation into a contract, it gives the process for the contracting officer to work through that deviation, because the deviations still have to be approved by the top dogs. So with that, Nicole, anything that you'd like to add for this one?
Yeah, no, just that we're, everybody's still kind of trying to figure out how this is all going to be implemented. We've started to see a couple of deviations issued on the first couple, we're starting to get questions about them. So, again, we're kind of encouraging a lot of communication with the contracting office and the contractor just to kind of figure out how to implement things. But yeah, I think you have that piece covered. It's all new territory, so don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, you have to ask questions. If the screen isn't moving, let us know. We'll get out there. But I will tell you, I've been very pleasantly surprised by the speed at which I'm seeing the updates and the transparency. You're getting a line out that's showing you exactly what's being taken out, and there's explanations and rationale on the website. So it's a nice tutorial for people. But what we're talking about is in the FAR itself. Not everything is in the FAR. Some of the stuff is in the DoD FAR supplement. Some of it's in the VA FAR supplement. So, Nicole, how are people going to handle those things?
Well, we'll see if there are changes. I think they're looking at the DoD and VA supplements as well. So we got to see how those change. I do expect there to be some hiccups with respect to how all these things interact with each other and understanding about what's required and what's not required. All of these changes are a process. So we'll see if there are contradictions, those will often need to be resolved either through this process, meaning, providing a lot of comment to go back and amend or change things to the extent we can. It's been a little bit closed doored on that front, but provide feedback with respect to how these things functionally work as much as you can. There is a place online that you can go to and provide feedback. And then we'll see how all of those things kind of start to interplay. But I expect there to be some downstream impacts from the changes to the FAR. And then we also are seeing changes to, when we're talking about market research data, the concept of the rule of two, which if you are in small business, and some of you are, or even frankly, if you're in large business, this can really, or contracting office, this can really impact you, because the rule of two basically says that if a contracting office believes or does its market research and believes there are two or more small or disadvantaged businesses or other set-aside category of business that can do the work, they should keep it set aside for that particular protected, class of, and I don't mean protected class in like a, DEI kind of way. I mean it as far as like a statutory government program. I always get that question. So, in one of those kind of set aside categories, right? So it's, so what I want to mention about that is that the rule of two is only codified at the VA. So, when folks say, well, why aren't we continuing to do that? The only VA contracts it's really codified for. The House does have a bill that they're considering right now to codify the rule of two. So if you feel very strongly about the rule of two, this will impact set aside significantly and market research data. So if you feel strongly about the rule of two, one way or the other, there are, make your opinions known in Congress because they are considering that bill. Okay, that's all I want to say about that. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about this bill. So there's been a lot of media about this bill, right? So it packs a lot in. But so I'm not going to comment on really what's in it. I mean, everybody kind of knows it's a budget and tax bill, right? But there's a lot of stuff in there. So if you care about what's in the specific policy goals that are in this bill, agree, disagree, what we all can tell is that whatever happens with this bill, it will impact the budget, which impacts contractors, right? So there is a version of the bill that went through the House. There's a version of the bill that went through the Senate. Okay, the scope of the cuts is the primary difference between the bills. The House cuts about $1.5 trillion. The Senate bill cuts about $4 billion. I'm kind of left out tax implications, and we could have a long discussion about long-term budget deficit. But the goal here is to let you know that the same bill is not in the House and the Senate. They've each passed their bills, and now they go to what we call a reconciliation process. Trump wanted to get this all done by July 4th so we could let off the fireworks and it would be one great celebration. That is not likely to happen. The administration is slowly backing off of that language. Maybe they'll get it done, but given the differences in the scope and kind of constituencies putting pressure on their representatives in Congress, I think it's unlikely to pass by July 4th. The reason they want to do the reconciliation process is because they can bypass the filibuster, right? So when it's a budget bill, the House and the Senate can essentially pass a bill regarding budget without that, 60 plus people, particularly in the Senate, which is going to be the steeper hill to climb. They can only do this with certain kinds of bills, which means they can't do essentially standalone legislation. This has to be focused on the budget. It has to be focused on tax cuts and current programs. It can't introduce new legislation or new programs. So that's why you're seeing it's very limited and they're being very careful. There's also limited debate, which means you don't get a lot of your play on the floor, right, with respect to debating the bill. But it is still subject to, this is really wonky legislative stuff, but points of order, which means that senators and House members can still challenge whether or not it's appropriate for reconciliation, essentially. So all that's to say that you should be watching this because it will impact funding to the government, and it's kind of in process to see what happens there. Next slide.
And speaking of budgeting.
Yes, let's talk about the budget. So OMB sent the Congress essentially its bill on May 2nd. It's not a bill, it's basically their budget. And they say, look, given all of the laws that we are supposed to be executing through the executive branch, this is what we want our 2026 budget to look like. I always say, budgets are just budgets. Congress still has to accept them, right? But it's important to see where the priorities of the administration are. It does reduce non-defense discretionary spending by $263 billion. That's a lot of contracts that go to contractors, right? So contractors are focused on these cuts, as I'm sure agencies are. What programs are they going to be able to continue and not continue? It does provide about a 13% increase for immigration and defense in the budget. But again, rarely does Congress approve the budget as the White House sends it. It's kind of like the White House's wish list, right? So I'm telling clients and folks that I'm talking to, like, no administration gets exactly what they want, even this administration. So we'll see what they do, but it does give us a really good line of sight into where the administration wants to go, which should not necessarily be surprising given where we've been in the last couple of months, right? We are watching closely cases that discuss impoundment. And this is like a wonky, I'm not going to try to get too lawyer on you here, but impoundment basically means like, hey, Congress gave the executive branch a certain amount of money. Congress holds the power of the purse. They get to decide how much money the executive has to spend on the priorities that Congress gives the executive, right? And under certain circumstances, the executive branch can say, we're not going to spend that money. And there are a few folks in the Trump administration that believe very strongly that the executive branch does not have to spend any money that Congress wants it to spend. It's kind of like a suggestion. So everyone's kind of teeing up for this fight because the executive branch wants to challenge what we call the Anti-Impoundment Act, which limits the power of the executive to withhold spend that Congress wants it to spend. So the only reason I'm really bringing this up is because I think you're going to start hearing it a lot in the next year or so, and everyone expects a case to go to the Supreme Court. So it's kind of important that you're watching for this terminology, because it doesn't really matter what the budget is if the White House doesn't have to spend it, right? They can just say they don't want to spend it, or they can move it around. So we're watching that very closely.
Okay.
Next slide.
So
you have anything, Bill? You want to chime in?
No, impoundment, that's a big legal thing, but I have learned a lot more about the lawmaking process over the years. And I was smiling as you were saying, this is the president's wish list to Congress. And then, president takes the Congress's appropriations as the wish list from Congress. So it's kind of interesting how everybody's pointing their fingers at everybody. But the work that has to get done still has to get done. And so with that, what are the things that people need to watch?
Yeah, so I'm going to skip a little bit down to legislation, given the fact that we're talking about the White House and Congress a little bit, because what you're seeing, interestingly, is more bills being introduced to, quote unquote, fix some statutory gaps, right? So we talked in the FAR overhaul about the fact that what's not statutory is being kind of ripped out of the FAR. So now the House is really focused in particular on fixing some of these things that are not expressly required by statute, but have come about via regulation, because they're like, oh man, for years and years, we made these bills really thin in order to get them passed. And we've been overly reliant on executive agencies to come up with the rules as to how to implement these laws. And now that regulatory book is getting thinner. So now I kind of listed out some of the things that I thought were pertinent to this group. And I already mentioned the rule of two is considered, there's a House bill about the rule of two, but there's also this plain language and contracting act, which basically is like, we should make everything readable. Everyone should be able to read this stuff. It shouldn't take a lawyer to read it, which sounds really great. As a lawyer, I kind of chuckle because often it's like case law that makes us be really wonky about our wording. So we'll see how this, even if they pass it, how that pans out. And then there's the WOSB Accountability Act, which basically requires certification in order to bid on WOSB work as opposed to self-certification. That's a big deal to try to make sure that women-owned small businesses are actually run by women. Right. So the WSB community is very supportive of this particular bill, at least the groups that I've talked to about it. Can't speak for everyone there. There's also the Protecting Small Business Competitions Act of 2025. That's the Rule of Two one that I talked about. And then there's transparency and predictability in small business opportunities, basically asking SBA to create rules for what happens when contract opportunities for small business are canceled. I think that's an interesting bill just because of what is happening with regulations. So again, it's a bill that's saying, SBA, we want you to create the rules, right? And I think Congress is going to need to start moving away from, hey, executive agency, we want you to create all the rules, and more to, here are the rules we want you to implement, given what's happening in the administration. So that's just kind of a taste on the House side of what's been happening lately. And there's kind of a lot out there that's going on in spite of kind of these big ticket items that are taking a lot of media time. You also saw, we're also watching spending in the fall. We're going to see if agencies actually spend what they've actually been already allocated to spend. We saw a memo out of DoD regarding cuts to consulting and IT, really justifying the need to justify that consulting spend, justify that IT spend. Why does it have to be at DoD? Why can't they buy it off of a schedule or buy a commercial item? Really trying to make that process more efficient and reduce duplicativity. Did I say that right?
Yeah, that was very good.
And then we're seeing, really they want to, again, continue to ferret out DEI programs and any COVID-19 spend. So you're starting to see those kind of memos come out of DoD. I know we just have a few minutes left, so I want to touch very quickly on the False Claims Act and certifications. As Bill mentioned earlier, we're going to start to see more FAR deviations, and more FAR deviations, not just resulting from the FAR overhaul, but also from the other executive orders that have been issued by the president with respect to DEI, affirmative action plans, anti-abortion, right? So you're starting to see these certifications come to contractors that say, you're certifying that you're not going to use any of our federal dollars that we give to you to do the work you do on any of these things that we don't like, which is already the plaintiff's bar is gearing up for fights, right? Because they want, by certifying that, contractors have to be really careful that they are not discriminating against folks, that they're handling ADA claims and all of those employment law claims well, that they're not violating any of these rules, because if they do, there's also a False Claims Act, QTAM action waiting for them. So we're already starting to see movements in the plaintiff's bar to gear up for False Claims Act claims based on these certifications. So we're really watching that very closely. I know we have a couple of questions, Bill. Did you happen to see any that you want to address real quick before our time is up?
I will let you. I'm the one that came in from Mary. She was wondering that, hey, the administration did away with some of the proposed rules that to include in the FAR and the DFAR. And then it says the SBR, SDTR handbook language. So what we're seeing in the FAR is they're keeping stuff in the handbooks, but that belongs in that they feel doesn't belong in the FAR. So if there's guidance for a contracting officer, they're pushing that down. So the SBIR, SDTR handbooks are going to become more influential, but they're not going to be a FAR citation. You won't be able to say FAR requires this. So this is going to be a fun thing for the attorneys over the next few years. Is the distinction, the difference between, okay, it's not in the law, it's not in the FAR. How does this regulation fit into the hierarchy of the applicable rules? So that I think
and what you can litigate it. Yeah,
exactly.
It's going to be real interesting for the next couple of years. And then Robert asked, I mentioned the plaintiff's bar and False Claims Act, like what are they doing to prepare? They're advertising to possible claimants that this is out there. So if somebody walks into their office, I've seen this already, and says, hey, I don't think my employer accommodated my disability, that, the employee or former employee might not understand that there's a False Claims Act claim, but they are educating the plaintiff's bar that when that happens, there's a False Claims Act claim there as well, because they certified they wouldn't engage in any activity that violates Title VII. So that's what's scary about it. They're becoming knowledgeable. And then there was a question about AI, and I know we're out of time, and whether there's any guidance for the use of AI tools on U.S. government contracts. The guidance is be careful. That the government is looking at using it, industry is looking at how they use it, but all of the guidance, different agencies have put out different guidance, but the long and short of it is you are responsible for whatever tool you use to either bid on a contract or comply with a contract. You cannot say, well, AI told me to, so I shouldn't be responsible, right? And then if you're using if you have like CUI or any of those types of like protected materials on your system, you have to be extra careful that AI can't go in and grab that material and use it in an improper way. So ask a lot of questions about what information these tools are grabbing, how it's used, and be careful about bias in these AI systems, because bias is built into the coding often. So you need to make sure that you're very careful about what you use and ask a lot of questions, but there's no standard training yet that's being required.
And my recommendation, read your RFP. I have seen some RFPs that say, we want you to use the daylights out of AI. And we've seen others that say, if you use an AI tool anywhere, you need to identify what information and which AI sources you use. So it's basic contracting. Read the solicitation, read the contract, make sure you understand what your customer is looking for, as well as all of those additional points that Nicole pointed to. Very important. Yeah. Okay, so John, if we're done.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm about to post a feedback poll. Tell us how we did today. We hope we did well, but if we didn't, we would like to know. All right. Thanks everyone, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you guys. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks.